My name is Brad Craver, and I'm a resident of North Carolina. Been here all my life. Grew up in the Carolinas. Uh, was always had an interest in history even when I was young. My parents were really diligent about taking me to historical sites in the Americas. Wake Forest graduate, School of Business Accountancy there. Moved into a variety of business level jobs and then ultimately ended up at Deloitte Consulting. Spent 26 years doing business and management consulting. I got a chance to travel the world a bit, but I always had this interest in public history. So I was either doing 18th, 19th century American history, and then as I got more deeply involved in sort of Dad's last part of his life, it got really close to me around trying to take my free time that I had, which was difficult raising two kids, married my high school sweetheart from my high school, and as I got a little into thinking about World War II history, I think Dad's service really became something that I wanted to lean in a lot more heavily in. And as we tell the story today about that, you'll see a little bit of reasons why. Uh, and it's just been wonderful to be able to be a part of what is freedom for Italy. I think this is something that's long overdue, and I'm doing my little small part to um, convert individuals that are not as knowledgeable about the campaigns in Sicily and North Africa, as well as obviously Italy, and through talks like this and other things that I'm doing across the globe. So today's talk is going to be centered around a bit of a primer on armored divisions, a bit more around what the First Armored was all about and how it come to pass. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time just to giving you a view from my father's perspective. And I'll introduce him photographically here in a bit, some stories about him. This is a talk that could be several chapters in length. So I'm going to consolidate this into 45 minutes or so. Each of these evolutions of the chapters of the First Armored Division is a major segment of history in and of itself. So we're going to go really, really high level in some areas, and then when I get to Dad's part, we'll do a little bit more of a deeper dive. Hope everybody's okay with that. If you've got questions, easily interrupt me through chat, or raise your hand, or come off mute and say, "Hey, Brad, I got a question." Perfectly fine for that. So, First Armored Division, Old Ironside's one soldier story. This is a topic for this. And let me see if I can get this to advance. So here's the table of contents of this deck, as well as a longer, broader deck that I'm trying to build, ultimately to have a full level presentation of a combination of First Armored and my father's service. He essentially served from Salerno all the way into the end of the war, and we'll pick into those details in a bit. I want to spend a little bit of time just grounding everyone around what is an armored division. They are not the same as an infantry division or Air Force Corps, or they have some uniquenesses, and they were created as a response for a certain set of deficiencies in the U.S. Army that existed as the war started to evolve in the early 1940s. So I'll do a bit of it around division as well. Dad's story, I'm going to focus in on a little bit of his early campaign at Monteporcia. We'll talk about the Anzo Nettuno landing, a little bit about the breakout, and then what subsequently happened with Dad in the early 2000s as he started to reconcile his service and began to really open up about his service days. And then I'll hold you, kind of keep you in limbo a little bit around the past, present, and future component of this that has continued to be an in-process work effort for myself. So U.S. Armored Divisions started the concept in 1940. The mission for U.S. Armored Divisions was really mission, design, response, and focus. There were four real elements that drove the U.S. military to move towards armored divisions. And I would say bottom left maybe was the most important start to that. The German Panzer divisions, which is German armored divisions, were wildly successful in Poland and in France. We all know that. And the U.S. military did not have an adequate response to that success. And so the powers that be that were putting together the concept of an armored division looked at and saw and wanted to somewhat emulate the successes that were occurring. We need to understand that World War One was sort of the birth of armor, but it never really became as sophisticated until the Germans rolled into Poland, and then subsequently after the Poland invasion into France. So the mission for and the doctrine for armored divisions was designed as and defined as a breakthrough division, an exploitation division, and was ultimately to take advantage of mobile warfare. It was an independent combined arms operation. So imagine what would have historically been multiple divisions combined from their capabilities into one. And they would be able to function and act almost completely with all of the doctrines for ground troops independently of any other divisions. Their focus was going to be mobility, firepower, and flexibility. And a lot of this will become extremely challenged when we start talking about the topography and the weather in the Italian campaign. So heavy divisions early on, this was the construct of the armored division when it went into North Africa. It was a big, huge, almost unwieldy set of division assets, almost 15,000 troops, 390 tanks, and all of the support systems that would be in that. So it was likely the largest combination of any U.S. armored infantry, artillery, and support services of anything in history. It proved to be a bit bigger than it could be managed through some of the actions in the North Africa campaign. So in 43 into 45, they trimmed down the number of troops, they lowered the number of tanks and the associated support systems for it, and started to think about combat experience and logistics were changing the demands for the armored divisions. So the divisions were then separated into smaller manageable groups, obviously headquarters and support troops. And this term you'll hear a lot, which is unique to the armored division as it would be compared to, say, the 3rd Infantry Division or the 45th Infantry Division, was this notion of combat commands. Combat Command A, Combat Command B, as well as Combat Command Reserve. These were all subsets of the larger light armored division organization you saw on the previous slide, and it did give that division an opportunity to be separated and to simultaneously support the overall corps and army actions across the Italian front. And keep in mind that the armored divisions were exploitation, they were counterattack designed to be able to support the sort of attack of the opposing forces from breaking through, and also gave them a ton of flexibility. So you can begin to see how these combat compositions were made to be able to do simultaneous activities, whereas an exploitation maybe at Aprilia, for instance, versus the fish fang component that we'll talk about in a bit. So they were broken up into a couple tank battalions. There were armored infantry battalions that were all half-track based. So this was a mechanized group, highly trained for mechanized warfare. Field artillery is 105s, 155s, and then all the associated engineering, tank destroyers, and recon that was to support the command composition. So imagine CCA would be half of this size versus CCB, so you could use it for flexibilities. The infantry battalions were made of about 700 soldiers. My father was part of the 6th Armored Infantry Regiment. It was in 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion, depending on how he got assigned. And you could also see the number of troops that have been in an infantry battalion. And all of the supporting engineering capabilities to look for opportunities to clear obstacles, minefields, digging in terrain for fixed positions, etc. At the division level, it went up to another level of field artillery. The recon squadrons were typically taken out of the headquarters and the division side. And again, we talked about engineering doing not only minefield work, but bridging, survivability, everything you could think of. So you can imagine that this division construct could essentially stand on its own without any other non-division support structure. And the last piece would obviously be, but probably the most important piece was sustainment and support. I've heard over the years that it took at least 8 to 10 support roles, support soldiers to support one combat infantryman that was out in the field. It was actually deployed in active combat. So this was made up, a major portion of the overall deployment of the assets that were in the division. So as this came to pass, 1st Armored Division was the first activated in early 40. There was a gentleman named Bruce Magruder that was the major general that was assigned to really constitute the 1st Armored Division. Fort Knox is where it was activated, and that's where they developed the US Army Armored Doctrine to essentially not allow the tank portion of the divisions to ever be isolated from its infantry support. This sounds fairly rudimentary now, but when this was being constructed, it was a complete greenfield. There was no real doctrine for this particular deployment of assets like was just developed by Magruder. He was, ironically enough, educated in North Carolina and was a World War I veteran, as many of these gentlemen were as they came in. So how did 1st Armored sort of get deployed? This is a fairly broad picture of 2 fronts. First was the Africa portion of it, and the rest of it was essentially the Italian campaign. The coloring on the patch itself has significance. So imagine the infantry being, I think, from the early 1830s. U.S. Army started designating its branches into color schemes. So the blue you see on the lower left is for infantry. The yellow for the top was for cavalry, and then ultimately the artillery was the red coloring. So the patch was put together, and the logos and the division unit identifications were all designed to show you this whole notion of how you came together around armored with all of the aspects of what had been completely separated branches of service within the U.S. Army since 1776, I guess. So I'm not going to go into huge detail around this, but just imagine that the 1st Armored was initially deployed in North Africa and then ultimately stayed for the entire length of the war in the Italian campaign. During Operation Torch, which was the first deployment of the divisions as combined arms, was in Algeria during Operation Torch. And I've got 3 patches there on the bottom. The first one, obviously, is the 1st Armored we're talking about. The 2nd Armored was also assigned together as 1st Armored Corps. You may see this patch in the middle and you think, well, that's just a 1st Armored patch. It's actually a 1st Corps patch. And George Patton, General Patton, had the 1st Armored Corps in North Africa as part of the first deployment of these armored divisions. So you got Old Ironsides on the left and Hell on Wheels on the right, came together as one corps. I would say at the highest of assessments, it was a mixed bag of difficulties and learnings from the deployment in North Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps had been a part of a Panzer's division construct for literally several years. They had a far more experience and frankly had better equipment and better assets than the 1st Corps was able to deploy in North Africa. and the losses reflected that. The picture you have here is Ernst Harmon, who ended up taking 1st Armored Division. He was actually in 2nd Armored when Patton was in North Africa, and then after the difficulties the 1st Armored experienced, he moved over to 1st Armored and ultimately stayed in the Italian campaign for most of the war. He was a 2nd Cav World War I general. He was a colonel, I think, in World War I. And so a lot of those doctrines were pulled forward from the only experience we really had, and that was mobility through horses. He was involved in one of the last operations that the cavalry on horseback was ever deployed. Interesting character, very well respected, hard driver, and was essentially unleashed during the breakout in May that we'll talk about in a bit during the Anzio Nettuno campaign. What did we learn? Clearly, leadership was lacking, no experience to speak of. So we had to build that as a combined arms. The tactics were still clunky. We were still trying to understand how you would support artillery into infantry, into armored, all simultaneously, and take the best advantage of that. And I will say the training was domestic in the U.S., was expecting to be in a different place than North Africa and Italy. Training was probably much more Western Europe focused. In fact, many of the maneuvers for the 1st Armored Division were done in places like North Carolina, which are rolling hills and much more resembles France and Germany than it does North Africa or Italy. And so we had to learn how to be functional in those interesting topographies. So as we move into a little more closer into the Italian campaign, the 1st Armored landed in September of '43 in Salerno, or in Naples. Only a couple of the regiments from the 1st Armored were assigned to the Operation Avalanche. The rest of the division was still refitting and sort of recovering from the disasters to some degree, as well as some degree of success, as they obviously were able to push Rommel out of North Africa. So the deployment in Naples was relatively limited until '43 November. And that's when Dad moved into this particular AO. We spoke about Operation Avalanche, Winterline, and Gustav Line. There is an entire conversation and a whole presentation around each of those as it relates to 1st Armored. We're not going to go into that great of detail, but the bottom right picture you see is a photograph from Venafro talking about if you remember, the doctrine of armored was mechanized, rapid speed, optimization of breakthroughs, and rapid deployment into supporting structures. This is 2 81 millimeter mortar crews essentially walking across the mountain ranges in Venafro. You see no half track in sight, right? The entire learnings had to be relearned around speed, effectiveness. How do you deploy these assets into what is, if you haven't been there and haven't seen it, it's incredibly difficult terrain. And so I brought this slide forward just to have everyone continue to understand the terrain, the weather, and then the Germans, maybe in that order, was the most difficult portion of the Italian campaign. CCA was part of the division of the division. We mentioned a bit, Combat Command A was a self-contained half version of the entire division. And this portion of the 1st Armored was deployed in Operation Shingle after they had worked their way up from Capua, Naples, and then ultimately to Montelungo. I'll talk a bit about that when I go into the Monteporcio component of this. The Anzio Nettuno beachhead was was highlighted from the First Armored's ability to provide significant support for sort of static firepower from the artillery as well as from the tanks themselves. Were instrumental in thwarting Operation Fish Fang, which was in February. It was the last real German push to try to break the stalemate that was beginning to become the sort of the calling card of the Anzio Nettuno beachhead, and stalled the campaign until 44 May. And then the First Armored was then a bit unleashed. Harmon got his wish. He got a bit of control over the deployment of the assets, and was able to really take advantage of the First Armored's divisional capabilities for the breakout in May of 44. June 4th, obviously, we're all familiar with that date. First Allied units into Rome was part of the 81 Recon, as well as I think the 85th Division. And there were, or it could have been 88, so check me on that one. There's always been a bit of a controversy on who the first division was that came in. I don't think it matters all that much, but certainly the First Armored was part of that initial wave into Rome. Further battle campaigns that I'm not going to elaborate in detail today, but the Northern Apennines and the Po Valley were again significant challenges and opportunities for the First Armored. The Apennines reflected through the Gothic line some of the problems that we'd had across the whole campaign. The Gustav line and the Gothic line were difficult. Once the Apennines were breached, the Po Valley became ideal tank country. For the first time in the entire campaign, the First Armored was essentially untethered and unleashed to liberate one town right after another, whether it was small villages, major German occupied cities like Milan and others. And the ability of the division was showcased in the Po Valley. And then the German surrender in May of 45. So gives you a bit of a grounding around armored divisions as well as First Armored. Let's talk a little bit more to the one soldier's journey, which was my father. My dad's name was Joe Craver. He was born in October of 1922. He was the fourth child of 13 children and grew up probably as poor as you could. He made it all the way through the 8th grade and then found that he needed to essentially stop his education and try to support the family. In late 42, early 43, he got his draft notice. He decided that he wanted to have a little bit of control around where he was deployed. Went to the Navy recruiters. Wasn't that fond of what the possibilities were of a Navy career. Dad was a woodsman and a hunter and a fisherman. He liked to be in the outdoors. He felt like the Army was going to best serve him. And it actually did pay off for him in his career. He went to Camp Cross, South Carolina in 12 February for his gear assignment, first initial set of initiations, and then ultimately was sent to Camp Wheeler, Georgia for 4 months of basic training. The recruiter had promised Dad that after basic he could go home and visit his mother. And as it turned out, in March of 43, if you start synchronizing the timelines, the U.S. Army rapidly began the deployment of the First Armored into North Africa. Dad chose to, probably the only thing that Dad ever did that got him into trouble at any great degree in his entire life. He was just a kind, sweet man. He told his drill sergeant, "I'm going home. You can do whatever you want. I'm going to go see my mother before I go overseas." And so he was AWOL for like 7 days, came back and repeated basic training. They asked him to essentially teach portions of basic, but he did it twice. In retrospect, it may have saved him. The First Armored did get pretty chewed up from March, April, May timeframe in North Africa. And, Dad fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how fate would have had it, he decided that he would stay and do basic again. Went to Fort Meade, went to Norfolk, to Casablanca, to Oran, to Naples. And that period was from about 18 November until 27 November 43. So Dad's now in Naples. A few pictures of Naples. Some of these are First Armored pictures, others are not. But I want to just give you a view of what Naples looked like. Naples was a difficult place to live. The bombings had been substantial. Melanie and I and Brian were able to be there this past January just to visit some of the sites there. Clearly, Naples has come a long way. The partisan successes in Naples to essentially eradicate the Nazis and was astounding. It's great to read that history about the fact that Naples was liberated by its own people more than the Allies were able to claim in some of the other cities within Europe. Dad, when he got over, went into a place called the Repelduppel. It was a abbreviation that the GIs used for a replacement depot. And I've got a little bit of details around where that was. It was called the Dairy Farm. It got called a variety of different things. But this particular area is where he got assigned to the 6th Armored Infantry Regiment, 1st Armored Division, part of 5th Corps. He was assigned to an 81 and 60 mortar crew as a forward observer, and he functioned in that role for the entire war. The casualty rates for forward observers in World War II was about 49 to 50%. It's amazing that he was able to make it through the war reasonably healthy. He lost his hearing in one of his ears and had a frostbite episode in one of his feet, so he had some difficulties, but generally speaking, he made it. And I really attribute that to his ability to be an outdoorsman, and his growing up years really played well in his role in the 1st Armored Division. The 1st Armored, 6th Armored Infantry Regiment was essentially put into combat on 1st of January to assault one of a series of mountains that were the gate to the Leary Valley. And so the picture you see here, the bottom photograph is of Monteporcia, and the Task Force Allen, which was a subset of CCA, we talked about earlier, in CCB. It was a 3-battalion assault on Monteporcia. And then obviously the next mountain range you see there is Monte Trocchio. And then in the distance you see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on screen, but this is Marcella's favorite place, right? Is the Casino Abbey that's south of Monte Cairo. So this is the terrain that was needing to be essentially assaulted and the German positions removed. And it was one mountain range after another. Dad always commented that we thought we had gotten over the mountains, and then there was another one, and then another one, and then another one. And it was nothing that they'd ever seen before. The Appalachians in North Carolina, in the eastern seaboard, you go over the mountains and you're done. It's essentially off into the plains. That's where they trained. They were not anywhere near prepared for such an assault. So the Germans would put forward observation posts in all of these masses on top of the mountain range. They would have machine gun positions here and mortar positions just on the far side of the mountain range, and their artillery set in between the mountain ranges. They were hidden from view, and obviously a US GI like Dad had to climb this hill with these mountains, spot the German positions, and call in a variety of ordnances on those positions. And Dad had access to 60s, 81s, 75 pack howitzers, 105, 155s, up through the division communications for artillery management. When we got over to Anzio and Nettuno, they had access to the naval guns as well. So Dad felt like he was pretty empowered, but he was also pretty isolated. He may be out on his own doing this forward observer work. He may be with a commissioned officer or another private, but it was really up close and personal. Just imagine that his only device to do recon was a pair of binoculars, and that was it. Whereas we're seeing in Iran today around just how sophisticated targeting has become. It was very much old school back in 1944. A little bit, couple other pictures that you can see. I've got actually a place that shows the casino here. Three battalions were part of the assault. The British supported from the Cedro area. They were in that particular set of operations. Monteporcia was defended and essentially a moon-shaped circle of Germans behind it. And the British were able to assault some of the right flank of the German lines as the different battalions stepped off to assault this position. The Germans essentially put artillery fire on the second battalion before it ever even got off from its starting position. So they were under intense artillery fire for the entire period from 4 January until 7 January. The GIs were able to ascend the mountain, take it, and then lost it, and then were able to retake it later on in January 7th. The 6th Armored Infantry Regiment received a Distinguished Unit citation for this action, and this was essentially Dad's first combat experience. Just to give you another photograph of the difficulties of the terrain, this is an M10 Wolverine tank destroyer that would have been a part of the assignments of the artillery within the Armored Division. And you can see the terrain. The bridges were blown. Where does this tank go? It's just a very difficult logistical challenge to take what was supposed to be a rapidly moving mechanical-based division and deal with almost insurmountable topographical difficulties. But these were deployed, and as we got better at it as a division, they learned a lot from the early actions within the Salerno and extended to the Winterline and up to Cassino that were ultimately utilized in Anzio, Nettuno, the Apennines, and Normandy through the hedgerows, etc. Gives you another shot of how difficult the terrain looks. I don't know if Bucci is on the call today, but this is an area that he does a fabulous job of showing his visitors the difficulties in the mountain ranges that are in the Winterline and beyond. And this is just one photograph of literally thousands of positions that had to be overcome that make up the mountains that were part of this assault. Interesting connection that many of you may or may not have made. I'm sure that many of you watched some portion, if not all, of Band of Brothers. There was one episode during the kind of the early actions of the 101st where Bill Garnier reaches into his jacket and he finds a note that was supposed to be for him from one of his commanding officers about the loss of his brother in the action within the 47th Medical Battalion, which was assigned to the 6th Armored Infantry Regiment. So there's a quick piece that if you haven't seen it, go back and take a peek of Bill Garnier finding out about his brother Henry being killed in Italy during this action. These are some photographs that I've taken recently from 25 and 26 visits. This is the one on the top left is just a ground level view of Monteporcia. The one on the right is actually the opening into this particular area of operation coming from Montelungo, and the picture on the left bottom was taken from essentially the overlook from San Pietro. So I know we've had conversations about some pieces of the battle that raged across multiple mountain ranges. This gives you a bit of a view around what it might have looked like, and hopefully you can get yourself there at some point in time to see just the challenges that the British and the U.S. allies and essentially the United Nations of countries that were represented as part of the 8th and 5th Army in this campaign. After Porcia, 6th Armored came back, was refitted, and CCA was intended on and were part of the Anzio Nettuno landing. So Dad's regiment came back to Naples and got a little bit of training on amphibious landings. They had done essentially no training for that. And they were part of the 22 January landing. The 1st Armored's military police were the first in from the division, and then Dad's regiment and subsequent support staff were brought in on 25 January on a portion of the Nettuno landing beach called X-Ray Beach. So the bottom left is a photograph of the Nettuno landing with some of the 6th Armored Infantry as well as the 3rd Infantry Division, etc. And this is in the current military base. It's called the shooting range. It's just outside of Nettuno. And then Melanie was so kind to be able to arrange for a couple of visits there. We've been able to meet the commander of the base. He's a fabulous gentleman that is very interested in history, and so he was very welcoming. That's essentially X-Ray Beach, which we have had the opportunity to stomp around a bit on. As we moved later into the subsequent landings of material and supplies, as the Anzio harbor was opened up, you started seeing LSTs, landing ships, tank, landing ship infantry. And I pulled this slide up just for a couple reasons. One is that's an 81 crew that you see in the foreground, which would have been essentially Dad's crew. The ships in the background were arguably the most important asset for any of the landings during World War II, and were the most constrained of all the assets required to do what really needed to be done to put enough troops and supplies and support onto the beaches of Salerno, Anzio Nettuno, Normandy, Peleliu. You can go into the Pacific. I was able to meet a LST driver that I'll show you a picture of in a bit. But this was the asset that constrained much of the landing, essentially the speed by which enough of the required material could be brought to bear into the Anzio Nettuno landing area. The harbor's not very big, and so it was difficult to stage multiple LSTs, LSIs into this. I think they could get maybe 3 or 4 in the harbor at once, and they had to rotate them. But this gives you a bit of a sense for what it really required to get these landings accomplished. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail, but just to give you a flow, 25 January, 1st Armored hits the beach. They essentially go into active combat to try to exploit openings in the German lines, which by hour, day by day after the 25th became more difficult. As the Germans' 14th and 10th Army reconfigured itself across this front, the opportunities to exploit the speed and sort of dynamic capabilities of the 1st Armored was pretty limited. And the terrain, again, was difficult. The Mussolini canals had all been flooded. The only way to go from point A to point B was on elevated roadways and railroads. and they were all within German artillery range. And so the First Armored ended up trying to exploit opportunities in Apulia predominantly, maybe even supporting Eddie's family members that were there. The First Armored got deployed across both the British sectors as well as the U.S. sectors as one of the divisions that had the most capabilities around bringing to bear the combined arms. But you would see them get deployed across the whole front here that you see on this photograph of this map. Corps Reserve really only meant that they were not deployed on the front lines. The doctrine didn't really allow for tanks to be exposed to German infantry. That was a recipe for disaster. Not having the right level of infantry support for those. And you really can't deploy an asset like an armored division if you've got it in a frontline position. So as February 5th rolled along and beyond, the division was here, as you can see in the Pine Wood area. Bigger picture of as of 31 January, just to give you a sense for how much of a deployment of German assets, Kesselring as the commander in the Italian forces or Italian campaign brought to bear. This was as of the end of January. You can see the 14th Army as well as the 10th Army had essentially been able to provide enough coverage to manage both of these fronts. I think it gets lost a bit in the story around the breakout, which will subsequently come in May. Both the British 8th and the Allied 5th were facing two major armies, not just one. And so that sometimes the 14th Army gets a little bit lost in this as Mark Clark was making some of his decisions on whether to go directly over and cut the 10th off. He had the 14th in his front. So it's a bit of a more of a nuanced conversation than he missed an opportunity to essentially destroy an army. He mauled the 14th, as it turned out. The breakout, as you can see, this is a 25 May photograph or map for breakout from Anzio Nettuno. The First Armored was assigned to be between and support the 45th ID as well as the 3rd ID as the subsequent battle for Cisterna. And so you could see where the First Armored became exactly what their doctrine designed. It was once the breakout occurred, then they could exploit that breakout in mass, and they were able to do that very well. And then subsequently were able to go to Velitri, and then they got redeployed again as part of the movement that Clark decided to do late in May. So you can see that the movement was from Velitri actually back over towards Capaleone, and then ultimately on the western side of the Alban Hills versus the eastern side, which would have cut the 10th Army off. As you see this last picture, which is the end of May, into June, you can see a better view of the Albano or Alban Hills, Velitri. The First Armored is this circular or oval icon as it relates to U.S. doctrine for graphics, and they ultimately were able to roll into Rome in this direction versus the initial expectation to go more south and west of Velitri or east of Velitri. Next few slides are a little more about Dad. I think Bob, we're okay on time. I'm running a little bit long, but you want to be done in about, I think, an hour or so, right?
Good.
Okay, so everybody's good. So Dad's photographs in the center here. I won't go through each of these photographs other than just to show you a bit of points of emphasis. His squad was on the top left picture. That's a picture of an 81, a 60, as well as a 50 cal machine gun. They were in a weapons section that was part of 6th Armored Infantry. and Dad was a squad leader for that group. If you see a picture of more than four or more GIs from the Italian campaign, it's likely that 50% of them were either casualties or killed. So if you look at the center slide on the right here, Dad's on the far right, and two of those gentlemen did not come back uninjured. One was killed uh, instantly by an 80 mortar, German 80 mortar, and the other one lost his hearing from another mortar round that went off by his ears. Dad never saw the guy again, never heard from him again. And yet they were in squads together that spent, as every minute of every day together. And those of you that are familiar with the Nettuno AO, the top left picture is in the pine wood where the Allies were bivouacked to try to get some degree of protection from the insatiable desire of the Germans to bomb the entire beachhead. I've got a piece here. I'll send this deck out and won't necessarily read it all, but Dad was in 4 major battle campaigns: Naples, Foggia, Rome, Anzio, and Nettuno, the North Apennines, and the Po Valley, and was in combat from January 44 until May of 45. This is an excerpt from a book that Silvano wrote years ago that had a piece on Dad. Silvano Casaldi, if you're familiar with him, as a historian in Nettuno. And there, his awakening to yet another campaign was essentially getting bombed by Luftwaffe the first night they were there, and they lost 18 out of their company. And it didn't really improve very much until the stalemate. When they did proceed with the breakout, the first Armored lost 100 vehicles in the first day of the breakout of that operation. So significant casualties throughout, with a major lull in between. The problem with the lull, though, was that you were never safe. Dad would tell stories about he and the gentleman from Warrenton, Virginia, Ike Garman, was his foxhole mate. They would dig in every day or every night together, along with a couple of other fellows. And there's this one occasion where this was probably in July of 44, after the liberation of Rome. Dad was uncomfortable where the place that this other GI had picked. He told Ike, says, I just don't feel good about this. Let's go to another position and dig in, and I think it'll be safer. Dad, being a forward observer, sort of knew what the German artillery could do to you and where they would target. And so Ike and Dad moved to a different position, dug in, and then not a few minutes later, the original GI that had prepared some foxholes for them was killed instantly by a mortar round. And that's just was the nature of the existence in the Italian campaign for Dad and for many of his colleagues. A few more pictures. As I sort of talk about legacy, and my dad was part of a family of 8 boys that served. There were 9 boys that were part of the Craver family. The center picture is my grandfather, who was enlisted in World War I but did not go overseas. Each of the boys in the family enlisted at their particular time, or they were drafted. They knew they were going to get drafted again, go back to poor family in North Carolina, that they are susceptible to being drafted. And so we had 3 Cravers that were in during World War II. That would be one in the Navy, one in the Army Air Corps, and then one in the Army, obviously Dad. Dad's youngest brother was born in October of 43 when he was in Naples. Bottom right picture is a picture of what I fear has become a defunct group. It was the Anzio Beachhead Association. It was a lot of veterans that had spent their combat time in Anzio and Nettuno, and they got together fairly regularly. My brother Dan was able to take Dad to several of these. Dad's a couple to the left of the flag that you see there, and it really kind of helped him get through some tough times. This was a place for him to relate to what was a life-defining campaign. You think about the history of it, but you also have to think of the personal impact. And Dad was defined by his military history in many ways. Skip over that. So my interest in really becoming much more involved in trying to tell battalion campaign stories really started back in 2003 when Dad was able to go back over as part of a Stephen Ambrose tour that was led by a captain in artillery named Ron Drez. He's a tour guide for one of Ambrose's teams. And these are shots in a variety of places. The top left and bottom left are at the Sicily Roman American Cemetery. The top right is a view over the beaches in Anzio and Nettuno. The gentleman on the far right was the mayor of Anzio at the time, Silvano Casaldi, that we mentioned earlier. And then this gentleman here was from Lawrence, Kansas, and he was a landing craft tank driver and made 5 landings. He made Salerno, Anzio Nettuno, Normandy, and then did 2 in the Pacific. And what I found fascinating was Dad was spoke about the war only marginally until after this trip, and I think what was therapeutic for him and the stories that he told after the visit and how much more open he was about sharing his experiences was directly related to the fact that when he came in 43 and 44, he was significantly impacted, certainly by the military portion of this, the death and destruction. But I think he was more impacted by seeing so many Italians suffering in abject poverty, living in caves, homes destroyed, buildings completely on fire. He felt like the whole Anzio beachhead was on fire all the time during his time there. And to go back in 2003 and see buildings restored, little children laughing in the streets, older men and women that didn't look like they had been refugees, that they were healthy. He felt like that, maybe what he had done over there and his colleagues had done in Italy made a difference. He was met by Italian citizens in several cities that we went on this tour that named him as a liberator, liberazione, hugged him in the street, and let him know that they appreciated what he did. And it was life-changing for Dad as an 80-year-old, great dad, great father, but still had some lingering unresolved issues that this particular visit helped alleviate. We did a first armored plaque in Nettuno at the entrance of the 6th Corps headquarters. So that plaque has been up since, I think, Liberation Day in 24. We've done a wreath laying ceremony there each year since then. And some of these pictures are then and now, essentially. And then this is the inscription that we had on the plaque. I'm not sure if everybody can read that okay. This was the first armored monument / plaque that's been erected. I think in Italy, I haven't been able to come across another one anywhere. But this was an important event that we obviously wish Dad could have been a part of. but he was certainly the reason we wanted to commemorate not only his service, but Sixth Corps, Fifth Army, etc. A lot of special days since then. I've made return trips for which this should be the 75th anniversary, not 74th, 2019. Went back for the dedication for the plaque in Nettuno, May 24, January 25. Just completed a wonderful trip with Melanie and Brian Yarborough, who was a retired U.S. Army colonel. We circumvented the country, started in Naples, Salerno, ended up in Cassino, went to the Winterline, visited our new friend, our new best friend, Marco Altabello over in Campo Marino. Just had a wonderful time. Coming back in May of 26. While we were there in January, we were able to gather a really a nice cross section of local historians that have direct impact on telling the stories in this area of operation. As you can see in the picture on the left here, many of the faces you may recognize. And we hope that this will create a connection that these historians want to continue their great work together and make an impact on Freedom for Italy's mission, which is essentially to tell these stories to a broader audience and create a better appreciation around the commitment of folks like Eddie's father and my dad and others that committed a major portion of their lives to this campaign. The rest of the slide deck is a work in progress. And so if I'm ever asked to come back and do part 2, I'd be happy to do so.